Now I have the great pleasure of being joined by someone that I'm a big fan of, both for his radio show and for his writing, Eric Metaxas, host of The Eric Metaxas Show, and author of the new book, Martin Luther, The Man Who Rediscovered God and Changed the World. Now, Eric, I do not share your admiration of the corpulent German exactly, but I did really enjoy the book. I thought the narrative is very compelling, very readable, and I learned so much about Martin Luther that I didn't know before. And more importantly, I unlearned so many things about Martin Luther that I did know. It's like what Ronald Reagan used to say, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant, they just know so much that isn't so. That basically was my view of Luther, and your book corrected that a lot. So, yeah, what made you write it?
Most of what we know about him is a myth or a legend, or at least a half-truth, which is to say a lie. I didn't go into this book. I don't go into any of my books knowing what I want to write. I just go in with a healthy level of ignorance and curiosity and honesty, and I say I'm just going to write what I find. But what I found about Luther was that much of what is said about him over and over and over is just not true. The first thing is everybody says he was raised in a very poor family, that his father was a poor miner. He often said, kind of like politicians sort of furnish their street cred, you know, their humble bona fides. He says that my father was a humble miner. That's true, and it's not true. His father was a successful businessman in the mining business. He was socially upwardly mobile, which is an extraordinary thing in the 1480s, that there was enough of a free market that somebody could be not wealthy, but could get wealthy or could work hard, and that there was enough of a opportunity, let's say. So the father borrowed, it seems, a lot of money from the mother's family and started this huge business, and it had to work very hard to justify the loan, to get it, you know, to work out. So these were hard workers. But the more we know about Luther, there's a bunch of things in the book that are brand new. I talk about a couple of archaeological digs that were done, 2003, 2008, where they discovered that the actual house that Luther was born in is 3 times as large as they've been saying for 500 years. So it's kind of crazy. And then they found a lot of garbage, trash, and they could dig through it, and they discovered real evidence that these were people of some means. He was not raised under difficult circumstances.
No, they found nice toys. They found
nice toys. You read the book. Thank you. They found it.
I really enjoyed the book. I read it over a cigar because the body is a temple and the temple needs incense. The claim that comes later on in the book that you point out, which is probably the essence of the Protestant Revolution, and it's what Hamlet talks about, is that Luther cracked the cover of objective truth, cracked the authority and the ownership of objective truth, and we've seen a lot of varied consequences from that. On the one hand, we have political freedom and the nation states and liberal democracy. On the other hand, you and I both attended a former university called Yale, and there are people wreaking havoc over there because...
Is it still Yale, or have they changed the name because he was a slaveholder?
He was a slave trader. They have to change it to, I don't know, Mr. Rogers University.
Hale. I think Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale is the greatest man ever to graduate from Yale, at least previous centuries. And I think that they should change the name. But yes, the door that Luther opened, we all know, led to tremendous things and to terrible things. That's part of the price of freedom, right? In other words, when you say to people, you are free to say and believe stupid things, or to say and believe wonderful things. That's freedom. And in America, we protect people who say things we disagree with. That's at the essence of freedom. You know, and I know that it's a little more complicated than that. I wrote a whole book called If You Can Keep It, my book before this, where I go into how if you don't have a virtuous populace, if faith is not at the heart of a culture, self-government doesn't work. People will destroy themselves, as has happened many times in the past. Free market will not give us everything we're looking for. These things need to have people running them in such a way that they're going to give us what we want, right? So what Luther enabled, I think, led to great things. but it also led to many terrible things. I'll be the first to say it.
And I loved the point about mass communication. I loved when you're writing about how Luther himself didn't intend for his 95 Theses to spread as quickly as they did, as ubiquitously as they did, almost like a Facebook debate. You know, it gets out of hand and everybody sees it. And he said he had some doubts about them. He might have written it differently. How instrumental were two things to the spread of those theses: the sale of indulgences. My only quibble with your book, by the way, is I felt you were a little harsh on Pope Sixtus IV. I felt that but you know, people are a little harsh on Sixtus, and the confusion over the sale of indulgences married to this printing press where people on the other side of the world end up reading Luther's thesis and say, "Oh, Martin, good job, pal. I didn't know you read it."
The channels of communication effectively don't exist. The cultural elites, which in those days were the church and the state, have complete control. And if you try to get a message to somebody else, you can't. There's just no ability to do that. Suddenly, somebody invents the printing press, and you can write something, and whether you like it or not, someone else can copy it and print it and distribute it very cheaply. And then people who get it can reprint it and distribute it, and it goes on and on. It's no different than, you know, forwarding something, hitting reply all, and it goes to everybody, and you think, uh-oh, what just happened? That wasn't possible 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but suddenly everybody knows, and there's no way to get the horse back in the barn. Luther's theses, I mean, one of the hugest misconceptions in the story of Luther, which, you know, it's such a good story, people want to believe it, but they have this idea that in 1517, this young man wanted to stick his finger in the Pope's eye and post this incendiary document in the most incendiary place imaginable. Hey, how about the church door? And then you find out, no, that we're looking at it, you know, from a different perspective. What happened at the time was a humble monk who loved his church and loved his Pope, wanted to bring attention to something that he thought was dragging the church's name through the mud. And he did this for the church, for the honor of the church. He said, this is not right that we have allowed the practice of indulgences to get out of hand, so that people are coming to my confessional and throwing this piece of paper in front of me saying, hey, Padre, what can I get for this?
Yeah, you know, get out of penance free card, right.
That's what it is. So Luther saw, as a brilliant theologian and as a very serious priest and monk, he said, this is bad for the faithful. The souls of my flock are in danger. And so he says we need to have an academic debate, a proper academic debate, but everybody was having academic. It's what you did when there was, you know, trouble. You said, let's discuss it. So he writes in Latin, 95 points, some of them slightly provocative because you wanted to provoke a good academic debate. And he posts it on the local bulletin board, which is the church door. But it's as if, so you picture him with the hammer and nails thundering against the papacy, you know, and that's completely wrong.
Shattering the theology, right.
You might as well picture him with a push pin down by the laundry room, putting it on the bulletin board next to the thing with the missing cat and the guitar lessons. I mean, basically, that's what he did. But people saw it, and somehow it just spread, and it got way out of hand. He never intended it to cause trouble. That's a fact.
And speaking of his deference to the Pope and not trying to, you know, poke a nail into his eye, there's the most heartbreaking moment of the story is that he writes the letter to the Pope. He writes a letter to Leo X, I believe, and it never is sent.
Well, see, this is the thing. You start, I mean, I hope people will read the book because it's startling and stunning when you see what actually happened. It's the way real life works. Mm-hmm. Dumb little things happen. Stupid people misunderstand things. Good people misunderstand things. Miltitz, who was this papal legate sent to kind of deal with Luther, made some terrible mistakes. And a couple of other people involved made some terrible mistakes. He kind of kept thinking, if I could deal directly with the Pope, surely he has to see what I'm saying is correct. I'm not trying to upend Catholic doctrine.
I mean, so much of his point is that the Pope, Christian doctrine, church doctrine on indulgences is that, that remits penance and temporal punishment for sin. And while the Pope doesn't have jurisdiction over souls in purgatory, he can intercede on your behalf. He can ask really nicely for those souls to have less punishment. And then you get guys like Tetzel down at the ground who are hawking when the coin rings, then a soul out of purgatory springs. So so much seems to be Luther wanting to reach the Pope, wanting to go directly to the vicar of Christ on earth, the bark of Peter.
I mean, look, it's no different than a president like Reagan not knowing what's happening with his guys with Iran-Contra.
Right.
I mean, you realize that it's very complicated. So he's on the hook ultimately, but there are people that he has trusted, and obviously people like Tetzel were very fast and loose, and the corruption.
One moment that struck me is when Luther had not talked to his father for a while because his father wanted him to become a lawyer. So he's this genius. He's clearly a prodigy. Just as he's about to become a lawyer, he doesn't want to become a lawyer. He's struck down. There's this moment, this vision, this thunderbolt. And eventually they reconcile. And Luther's father says, God grant that was not an apparition of the devil that convinced you, to go and enter into the monastery. What are the odds that it was an apparition of the devil 500 years later?
The fact is, it could have been, but it doesn't matter because we serve a God who is able to braid plans B, C, and D back into plan A. Luther, his heart was in the right place. And, the Bible says God looks on the heart. This was a man who wanted what God wanted. And so sometimes we struggle to figure out what is it that God wants? What is God like? When he did this initially, his whole view of God was wrong. He had a view of God as a nasty judge who was just slavering, ruling to throw people into hell. If you have that view of God, you're going to act accordingly. And Luther thought the only thing I can do to cover my rear end is to go into the monastery. I'm not going to risk eternal hell for a good law career. So he goes to the monastery really, to cover his rear end. And when he gets there, he tries as hard as anyone to pray his way into the peace of God and to, in effect, earn his way. This is what happens, is that he has this sense that I've got to do this and this and this and this. I've got to jump through these hoops. And you feel like you're performing and you're failing. And what kind of a God would put you through that hell? So you begin to resent God and hate God. He's reading the Bible. And of course, famously, at some point, he discovers this idea that we are saved by faith. The righteousness of God is given to us. It's not something that God uses to beat us into hell. He gives it to us as a free gift. So it turns his world upside down. And right around the same time was when he decided to post the theses on indulgences. And so it all kind of exploded thereafter.
The portrait you paint, as you've just described, is of a guy who is an obsessive, he's neurotic, he is constantly worrying himself to death. He seems to have a great fear of death. He's so gaunt and thin, not like that portrait that we imagine of him. And then later on, he becomes this garrulous, fat German fellow. And he's constantly troubled by intestinal pains. A priest friend of mine, because of the word in cloaca or ox cloaca, it is suggested that he had his epiphany about Romans while sitting on the commode, and my priest friend wondered what torrent of commentary he could have unleashed on the world with a modern colonic irrigation. That is neither here nor there.
But of course, I make fun of the Freudian. That's
what I want to ask about, are these Freudian theories.
Right. There was a guy named Eric Erikson who wrote a book about Luther called Young Man Luther. And if you want to talk about a mid-century horror of a cliche, Freudian nonsense, 350 pages of Freudian nonsense, really giving Luther no real credit for being a person. He's
no
just
rational credit.
Mass of urges and constipation and libido, and hey, that's what makes the world go round. Of course, that's not true. But in 1958, it was difficult to argue against it. So yeah, people really misunderstand Luther in that way too. They said, oh, his father was really cruel, and he was rebelling against his father, and that there was this Oedipal spasm against his father and the Father God that made him do everything he did. It's completely ridiculous. And again, the least you can do in a biography, and I hope I do it in my book, is simply tell the facts, and a story emerges from the facts, at least if you have enough facts. And at this point, we can say we do.
You certainly achieve it in the book. It's really, really good. I highly recommend it, even as a very popish fellow and traditionalist conservative. I really, really enjoyed it. I recommend that everybody go out and read it. It's Martin Luther, the man who rediscovered God and changed the world. We can quibble about maybe the subtitle or Sixtus the Fourth or what have you, but a really good book. Everyone should go out and read it. And of course, listen to the Eric Metaxas show. It's a great show. And Eric, thanks for being here, and we definitely want to have you back as soon as possible.
Michael, it was my joy. Thank you so much.